Good morning. I'm Michal Biran from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and it's a great pleasure to open this session on Muslim minorities in China. Muslim consists about 2% of Chinese populations, which means we have more than 20 million Muslims in China, more than several small Middle Eastern countries. And those Muslims are divided into more than 10 minority groups, but we will hear today about the two major ones, the Hui, the Chinese Muslims, who speak Chinese, who write in Chinese, who have been living in China for many centuries, and are the only difference between them and the Han majority is mainly the fact that they practice Islam. So this is one group, one major group. The other group is the Uyghurs, who are concentrated in Xinjiang, in also China. They are part of the so-called Chinese Empire only from the mid-18th century. They speak Turkic, they write in Turkic. Their tradition and custom are very different from those of the Han Chinese. And we have here two leading experts on these two groups, so I hope it will be a very interesting session. Our first speaker is Professor Zvi Ben Dor from NYU. Zvi began his BA and MA at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Department of East Asian Studies, of which there are quite a few people in the audience. He did his PhD at UCLA, and he's now a professor for history and Middle Eastern studies in New York University. He has published widely and on many things, but focusing on the question of interaction between religion and world history. His main books include The Tao of Muhammad, A Cultural History of Muslims in Late Imperial China, published by Harvard in 2005, and then the intriguing The 10 Lost Tribes, A World History, published by Oxford in 2009. He also co-edited a volume about modern Middle Eastern Jewish thought that was published by Brandeis in 2013, and he's now working on a monograph about Crescent China, Islam in the Nation After Empire. So, and we're all looking forward to see it.
Grateful for this generous introduction and also the very important distinction between the Hui and the Uyghurs. Thank you. So my talk today will focus on the Sinophone Muslims of China, and by way of defining them, I would just basically say that this is a very, very diverse group of people. That perhaps the only thing that unites them is that they speak Chinese, actually. But you can move from one village to the other, or one territory to the other. These are different Islams and different Muslims. So let me actually begin with the conclusions of my talk, and then walk you through some visuals, and then analyze them. This is, this conference is about contemporary Muslims. My talk will actually focus on 17th and 18th century Chinese Muslims, but I should therefore then begin with some comments about why this period that I will discuss here matters to the contemporary period. So this is why I'm going to begin with the conclusions, and then I'll deliver the lecture. Okay, so several things in a telegraphic and simple way. Chinese-speaking Muslims of China that are known at the time as the Huihui or the Hui are today considered a nationality. Okay, in other words, to be a Hui, yes, or Huizu, is first of all a question of nationality, not a religion. Okay, this is the official formulation that was handed down by the CCP already in 1948. And in the book that I'm working now, I'm actually arguing that this is a response to the partition of the subcontinent. It's a very complicated story, but basically already then, the CCP writes this huge pamphlet, called the Huihui Minzu Wenti, the questions of Muslims in China, or the questions of Islam in China. And the very first sentence there is that the question of Islam in China is a question of nation, of nationality. Okay, it's not about religion. Now, this is the only religion in China that is understood as a nation, or as a national minority. Christians in China are not a nationality; they're just Christians. Okay, so are Buddhists. The Tibetan case is a little different. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more as we go. In the past 2 decades, we actually have proof that this is the situation, because we can see a bifurcation of terms, because, you know, Hui is a nationality, or being Hui means a nationality, but of course there is Islam, and the Islam is a religion. So we have a new word in Chinese that actually appears in the Republican period, but then is erased and then resurfaced only after the Cultural Revolution, increasingly now, which is actually Islam Jiao, yes, the religion of Islam, or the teaching of Islam, okay? And I would argue that today these two terms, you know, Huizu, yes, Chinese Muslim nationality, and Islam are considered, beginning to be considered two separate entities. In fact, 10 years ago, there were two books that came out. One is called, like, each of them is like 1,000 pages. One is called, you know, The History of Islam in China, yes, and another one called The History of the Hui in China, and there's two different volumes. So we therefore speak about two histories. The history of Islam in China and the history of Muslims in China, or the history of people who identify as Muslims in China, or as the Hui. Okay, I think we have to make this distinction also because when we talk about Muslim minorities elsewhere as well. Okay, I would venture even to say that this is an important methodological issue, you know, for everyone who's working on that. You know, French Islam is one thing, French Muslims are completely different, even though, you know, the histories are, of course, very much intertwined. Okay. Now, my talk today focuses mostly on the history of Muslims in China as opposed to the history of Islam, okay, in China. And the period I discuss is therefore the most important chapter in the rise of Hui subjectivity. In other words, you know, the way in which people begin to identify themselves within a certain body of China, which I will describe in a minute as well. You know, how they describe themselves as a certain collectivity with one story, let's say one identity, you know, and even one mission or one vision within this great body that we can understand as China. Okay. And this is why it matters to the contemporary period, because, you know, what happens in the 17th and 18th century really very much reflects what is going on today, even though I think today things begin to change again. Okay. Now, we can, and perhaps we should, you know, focus on internal aspects of Islam when we study its history. And in parentheses here, I would like to draw your attention, for example, to Scholem's insights about, you know, the internal dimensions of Jewish history as opposed to the history of the Jews, you know, when he talks about different things that comes from within as opposed to different things that comes from without. I think that when we write about history of Islam, you know, we can afford to, like, focus on internal aspects. But when we write about Muslim minorities, we really have to study them within the cultural and political context where they are embedded. You know, we cannot just isolate them and talk about their histories as isolated trajectories. This is very, very important. And I'm saying this because what you're going to hear a lot today is not actually about Islam, but a lot about Manchus. Okay, so I need to justify me speaking about Manchus in this context, or in fact, about Manchu Qing ideology. Okay, which is actually not only shapes the empire, where the Hui identity begins to emerge, but also the empire, but also the political dimensions of this identity. Finally, or penultimately, when we speak about Islam in China, there is, of course, an elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is the Uyghur question. Okay? The Uyghurs are the people who live in the territory known today as Xinjiang, the new dominion. Yes. I speak about Uyghurs as well, but my Uyghurs are really an avatar. They're not real Uyghurs. I mean, I think we're going to hear about real Uyghurs in the second session, okay? But they matter a lot. They matter a lot in the 17th and 18th century, in the 19th century. In fact, they are one of the significant others of the Hui. In other words, the Hui shaped their identity vis-a-vis the Han Chinese, vis-a-vis the Manchus, but also vis-a-vis whom they imagine to be the Uyghurs. And they don't really like them, by the way. Okay? And if I'm asked, I mean, I sent a paper, and I have ever since then I began reworking it, thinking about it in more broader terms. And if I want to make some sort of a theoretical intervention here, I would say that one of the issues that we should think about is the question of Islam, the problem of Islam and universalisms. Yes. We have different universalisms today. Yes, the liberal universalism, socialist universalism, Western universalism. Recently, we have something called in America Judeo-Christian universalism. And of course, we have Zionist universalism. All of these things are universal, but they're very, very local, as we know. So what I'm going to do now is actually talk to you about, the question of Islam and Manchu Qing universalism. Now, let's see if it's going to work. Okay, so our story begins with a concubine, okay, which is, I think every good Chinese history should begin with a concubine. So this is Xiang Fei, the fragrant concubine. She's very, very famous. She is brought to the court in the early 1760s, after the conquest of Xinjiang by the Manchus. The Manchus are a people who conquered China in 1634. They created a huge empire, and they keep expanding it well into the early 19th century. And one of the most precious jewels is actually Xinjiang. Now she's brought to the court with an entourage of other Muslim Uyghurs who speak Turkic. And Qianlong, who is the emperor that brings her to the court, is really, really eager to see her. He leaped from his throne, he ran into her, he was really into her, he really, really loved her. Okay, she was his most precious concubine. Okay, he builds a mosque. Here's another picture of her. And by the way, these paintings, if you see a hint of a European style painting, this is because the painter is a Jesuit named Giuseppe Castiglione, who lives in the court, and he is the court painter. He does a lot of portraits of the people in the court, particularly of the empire and the people whom he likes. So this is a quick map that just shows, the excursions, leading into the area, the military expeditions in the 1750s, leading the Qing armies into the territory that becomes later on as the province of Xinjiang. Okay, this is mid-18th century. It's a peak moment in the creation of this empire. Okay, this is another painting attributed to Castiglione. I think maybe my colleague would know more about this than I do. Okay, I mean, here he is a kind of a Jeanne d'Arc-esque approach to her. And here they are. This is ostensibly the Qing Emperor Qianlong, dressed as a Manchu hunter, okay, not as a Confucian scholar, but someone actually who's a very, very military figure, yes. And here is his favorite concubine. And pay attention to the sheepish, very, very feminine Confucian Mandarin who's just walking slowly behind them. No beard, no mustache, certainly no armor, no nothing, okay. Where two of them are really armed. Now, Qianlong really liked Xiang Fei, so he brought with her, so she won't be homesick, he brings a whole entourage of Uyghurs from Xinjiang to live in Beijing. They form a camp in the city, and he builds a mosque for them, yes. And this mosque is an interesting mosque. It's a mosque that faces north, because when you sit in the Forbidden City on the throne, the emperor faces south. So everything, when you bow in China, you bow north, This is the Chinese Qibla, you have to face north, okay? And he creates he writes a stele in this mosque in 5 languages, because, this is a multi-ethnic empire, and, this is an emperor who brags that he speaks all the languages of all the people, okay? This is the way that he's universal. Okay, I learned Mongol, I learned Tibetan, I learned Turkic, I learned all the languages of all the people whom I conquered, etc., etc., etc. Okay, this is a very important element of the ideology of the empire at the time. So you can see here, this is the first part of the stele, and this is the second part, and you can identify a little bit, there are different languages that are written in it. Manchu, Mongol, Chinese, Turkey, etc. Okay. Now, few words about Manchu ideology of the time. I already hinted that this is an ideology that speaks about a multi-ethnic, or I wouldn't call it multi-ethnic, but let's say multi-everything empire. Okay, and one of the things that the emperor wants to do at the time is actually to say, look, all the religions, all the ethnicities, all the collectivities, however you want to define them, are embodied in me, okay, in the body of the emperor. Okay? If you remember, you know, one of the more unfortunate prime ministers of Israel said, I'm going to be a prime minister of everybody when he was elected. Okay? This was an imperial move that didn't really work. In the United States, if you look at the recent presidents, they do something like this as well. Whereas all the American presidents until George Bush the first basically were just white Americans. In Clinton, we see something very, very interesting. Clinton is white, but he's also black because he goes to black churches and his library and his office are in Harlem. You know, that's a hint that, you know, the black community is embodied in the presidency. George Bush II, you know, toyed with the idea that he was Hispanic. Yes, on the grounds that his sister-in-law is Mexican. I think this is going to come back in the next election. And of course, the current president is Jewish. Yes, he is of course not Jewish, but he's Jewish because he holds the Seder, the Passover Seder, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, so these are forms of universalisms that are embodied in the body of the ruler. Okay, and in China they do it too. Okay, the Manchus are in fact they perfected it. And it works for almost all instances, with the exception, I think, of the Uyghurs. So the opening of the Stele is as follows. It is sublime to be the master of the world, so that even the remotest regions, people in the remotest regions, people submit to our control. And wherever our laws and methods have access, our customs and practices are adopted. In other words, we come in, we are the empire, we make everybody submit to us, you know, and conform to us. But, yes, you know, and here's the universal moment. The universal moment comes in again. And I want you to think about the opening lecture about, you know, multiculturalism, okay? It is only by accommodating the different ideas in different peoples that a real uniformity can be attained, in order that our civilization may be so comprehensive as to leave nothing outside. Okay. In other words, I'm the emperor. I'm going to go and conquer your country. Yes, I'm going to make you adopt my customs and my practices. Yes, but in order to achieve uniformity, I'm going to listen to your practices as well, to your pay heed to your culture as well. Okay. The end of the Stele, and I make a big edifice out of this in the next version of the paper that I'm writing. He has a poem. And the poem actually is about Islam. And the last section there says, Western direction, Northern direction, yes, heading towards the same goal, showing one respect. In other words, here you see the emperor fully acknowledging that a northern direction of the Qibla is wrong, is something that is not, you know, practiced in Islam. You know, a Chinese mosque must face west, towards Mecca or towards the Kaaba, yes, not the throne. But here we are, you know, the remotest people from the remotest regions are being accommodated. So I'm going to put it, he could have ignored that, but he's actually not ignoring this. He says, yeah, I know that you have to face west, but I'm making you face north, and I'm going to tell you now that it's the same. Yes. And a traveler in 1910 who commented on this Stele says, well, bowing west towards Mecca or bowing north towards the throne, Muslims respect the Prophet and the Emperor alike. You know, he basically makes himself equal to the Prophet. Yes, and here's the comment. The emperor always sits facing south. Consequently, all Chinese officials bow north. The Muslims in China bow to the west towards Mecca. The emperor classes both acts together and thus makes himself equal to Muhammad. That's the comment. That's the interpretation. And here's the problem. Okay. These are, in fact, the northern direction of the mosque, yes, renders it, you know, not halal. You know, you cannot practice in this mosque, and no Muslim ever worshipped in this mosque. Maybe some did, Yes, but they actually, most of them didn't. And here we expose actually the problem of Islam with Qing Universalism. Why? Because, you know, we Muslims, we don't buy this. We have something called Sharia, yes, and with you great Qing, you know, you have great things. You built this mosque for us, but it's not working, okay? And Pamela Crossley was one of the most prolific scholars who work on Manchu Qing ideology. She basically says, look, you know, Islam presented an absolute obstacle to the necessity of Qing emperors to occupy the single point of transcendence at which all moral systems converge. Yes, a portion of Mongols might accede to the Qing representation of themselves as Qingis. Yes, I mean, this is what the Manchus do vis-a-vis the Mongols. A portion of Chinese might accede to the Chinese Qing representations of themselves as avatars of Confucian benevolence and civilization. No portion of Muslims accede as they might to the reality of Qing power, yes, etc., etc., etc. In other words, the Chinese emperor, in this case the Manchu Qing emperor, could not situate himself at the center of the Islam, of the moral universe of the Muslims of China. He could do it with the Tibetans, he could do it with the Mongols, he could do it with the Han Chinese, but not with the Muslims. And, you know, I took the northern direction of the mosque to be the symbol of that, okay? Now, the emperor could be a Buddhist deity, he could be a Taoist monk, he could be a writer, father, son, recluse, hunter, a banquet host, beardless youth, future ancestor, etc., etc., etc. Everything you can imagine, you know, far more imaginative than the Black Clinton or the Hispanic Bush, yes? But he could not be the prophet. And here is again Castiglione. This is Qianlong's father, the Emperor Yongzheng, early 18th century, dressed basically as Louis XIV. Why not? Here him again, yes, hunting a tiger. And this is the young Qianlong in court dress, very, very Chinese actually here. But here him again, here is a Manchu hunter. Okay? Here is a Confucian scholar. And pay attention how different it is from this one here and this one here. Okay? Here's the emperor with a battle dress going to war. And here he is writing a poem. And here he is writing another poem. Here he's watching some Mongols fighting. And here you have some Kazakhs who came with horses from Kazakhstan, and he's just sitting and observing them. They're bowing to him, etc. They're probably bowing north. He's getting more tributes. And the most important, I think, element is the success of the Manchus with the Tibetans. The Tibetans, here you can see the emperor really situating himself at the center of the Tibetan universe. Okay? This is the Manjushri, you know, this is a very important, the central most important Tibetan deity in Tibetan Buddhism. And this was commissioned by the emperor to represent himself at the center. All of this was done by Tibetan painters. The detail in the middle was done by Castiglione. Okay? And here he is as the Buddha. Hunting again, more. And here he is as a Taoist, etc. Now, so we can see that Islam in China actually stands out. The emperor cannot be that. You know, when he finally builds the mosque and says, okay, bow north, no one bows north. Here's what I want to, want to make two moves and two deviations. The first one, we cannot reduce Islam only to Sharia. The second one, yes, is actually we have to not focus on what, not only focus on what the government does, what the state does. We also have to make sure that, you know, the Muslims themselves reserve the right to imagine themselves written into the body of the emperorship. In other words, yes, they can situate the emperor in the center of their moral universe on their own terms, okay? Which conform to Islam in a different way without too much deviation. In other words, it's not only that he needs to mean something to them from his terms, on his own terms, i.e. building a mosque that faces north. You know, we need to focus also on Muslims, what the Muslims are doing at the same time. Okay. And I have identified, and I work on mostly on textual Muslims who are elites. These are actually tiny elites, very, very Confucianized. are very, very sophisticated writers, you know. I mean, in China, most writers tend to be very, very sophisticated, at least those who survived, yes. Very sophisticated politics in there. You need to read them very, very carefully, understand what they do. Okay, so I identified 3 strategies. The first one actually hails from the early Ming, okay. When the Ming dynasty succeeds the Mongol dynasty, yes, and the Ming at least project themselves to be a only Chinese government, you know, an only Chinese, let's say, nation, you know. This is what they project. This is not usually what they do, but this is what they try to project. Yes, the Muslims develop a certain strategy in China, which is usually folklore, in basically making the argument that the emperor is in fact a crypto-Muslim. I wrote a whole big paper, what is the cultural meaning of that? Yes, so in a way, you know, the tale that they tell themselves in the mosques in different areas in China is actually, look, you know, we are living in a Chinese territory that is decidedly Chinese, but no one really knows the truth. The truth is that the emperor is a crypto-Muslim and he hides his Islam and no one knows that. And if you want a proof for that, is you see, there's no trace of Islam in his behavior, and that's the proof that he's a crypto-Muslim, okay? And then there is a very, very careful reading of Chinese text to prove that. And I want to draw your attention to many, many tales that sometimes minority communities in different places in the world are telling. So-and-so is a kidnapped Jew, so-and-so is a crypto Jew, etc., etc., etc. I mean, this is something that is going on. I argue in the paper that I wrote that is actually modeled on Mongol tales about, you know, one of the Ming family that argued that they had some Mongol element in them. The trick is that here's how you rationalize, you know, your existence in a non-Islamic territory here. So the ruler is in fact a crypto-Muslim.
What's a crypto?
Crypto, like someone who's hiding his identity, okay, making it a secret, okay, presenting himself to be something else, like a Muslim in the closet. Yeah. Now, but in fact, when the Qing come in and they come in with and they make the argument that we are actually accommodating all religions, accommodating all traditions, etc., and we are a multi-ethnic empire, then we see a change. Then we see a rise of textual traditions that actually make a completely different case. Okay, and I want to dwell on two cases. One, yes, is Joseph. The case of Joseph is interesting. We're talking about one of the most important Muslim scholars of the time, a 17th century Muslim scholar from Yunnan, very, very Confucianized, but also with aspirations to be a leader. He claims he's a Sayyid. And he writes a letter to the emperor, very, very long letter to the emperor, you know, in which he basically exposed the Ming emperor as someone who protected Islam, someone who protected, you know, Muslim books, etc., etc., etc. And he says, this is what he did. And the insinuation, and of course, everything is carefully crafted there. I mean, you're writing to the emperor, you might lose your head. So you have to be very, very careful in what you suggest. And he basically suggests, this is what you need to do too. Okay. The second letter that he writes, and he actually moves from Yunnan to Beijing trying to get audience with the emperor, he says, look, you need to, I would like to be appointed as the head of the Muslims in China. You should appoint me as the head of all the Muslims in China. Okay, and he makes the case for it. He says the Muslims now are completely wayward. In fact, they deviate both from Islam and from Confucianism. Okay, if you appoint me, I'm going to bring them back to the two traditions, make them loyal to you, etc., etc. That's the story. Okay, why is it interesting? It's interesting because he wrote an autobiography which he attached to the letter. And in the autobiography, he identified himself in his Islamic or Arab name, Yusuf. Now, unlike what some of my colleagues would think, and maybe, you know, Rafi can say something about it too, I think that until the 20th century, no Muslims in China, at least, you know, within China, was born with an Islamic name. They were given Chinese names, maybe, you know, and then they arbitrarily adopted a Muslim name. Okay, so in other words, when this man adopts the name Yusuf, okay, as opposed to Mahmud or Muhammad or Nasser, etc., etc., yes, he tries to make here a statement. Okay, it's a deliberate move. And what's the statement that he's making? Let's think about Joseph. We all know the biblical story about Joseph, yes, but we have to think about the Islamic Joseph here. And, you know, there are several Islamic Joseph. You know, there's the mystical one. You know, there are also mystical dimensions to his image. I'm not going to go talk to you about it. But if we zoom on the basics of the story of Joseph, this is someone who is in exile, okay? He lives in Egypt. Okay, in a form of imprisonment where he resists the cultural temptations there, you know, even the sexual temptations at the same time. And then he rises to power and he's appointed by Pharaoh as, you know, someone who is in charge. You know, the biblical Joseph is, of course, in charge of all of Egypt, yes, and all of Egypt's property. Other all, you know, were Jews, yes. But the Muslim Joseph at least is in charge, you know, on the group to which he belongs, okay. In other words, so what we have here is a sort of a mini sovereignty within the sovereignty of the ruler of China. Okay? And my argument is this is what this man is suggesting. He says, look, you have a community here that is defined by a certain story. Yes, it is different than the others. You know, they are loyal subjects of the throne, but they deserve to be identified as distinguished, as a distinct collectivity if you appoint me, Joseph, as their ruler under you, okay? Just as Pharaoh, yes, says, you know, you, Joseph, you are my second in command vis-a-vis the rest of all of Egypt, with the empire of Egypt. But when it comes to the Israelites or the Hebrews, you know, you are their ruler, okay? This is what he's suggesting, okay? I take this to be one of the most important signs of a rise of, you know, this is a scholar who basically expresses the idea of a collectivity there. Okay. And by the way, this man, you know, is really full of himself. He never got was never granted any audience with the emperor. The emperor really dismissed that. But he makes a tour in China where he spreads that message in different Muslim communities, actually making them one. He also writes a very important book in Islam, on Islam as well, where he makes his story. The second most important element, and in fact far more intriguing, is the third strategy, which appears about 50 years later than the idea of Joseph. And this is what I call the first Hijra. Okay? So it's not a typo there, the two first years. What is the first Hijra? Okay? We find it in a Chinese version of the Sirah, of the Prophet, okay? In which we have a very, very interesting situation there. Okay? It's a translation of a 14th century Sirah that is very much like the Sirah that we know in the Western world of Islam. Okay, but there are some problems there. First of all, you know, the translator inserted certain sections that do not exist in the original. The first one, he says, look, in the second year of the call, the Prophet communicated with the Tang Emperor and sent Muslims to China. Okay, in the second year of the call, you know, there were maybe 5 Muslims all over the world. Yes, Muhammad, according to this Sirah, sent 3,000 Muslims to China. Okay. Then comes the second Sirah, the second Hijra, which is for us the first Hijra. This is the Hijra ila al-Habasha, yes, the Hijra to Ethiopia or to Abyssinia. Yes, sorry. And then comes the third Hijra, and the most important one, you know, which is the Hijra to the Prophet, to Medina, that actually constitute Medina and constitute the Ummah. Okay. Interestingly enough, if you look at what Chinese Muslims are doing at this period, they are obsessed with the Hijra to Abyssinia. Why? Because that Hijra creates a new model of Muslim existence that applies to them. Whereas, when you move in 622 to Medina, you turn Yathrib into Medina. You create the Ummah. And the Prophet is the ruler, is the judge, is the military commander. This is the quintessential Islamic polity. Okay? But this is where every Muslim should live, in fact. This is the ideal community. But if you are in exile, if you're outside Dar al-Islam, you know, you have to look for a different model of existence in early Islamic history. Maybe not in the Sharia, but maybe elsewhere. Maybe in an authoritative text such as the Sirah, which is good enough. Okay? And then you find Ethiopia. Ethiopia is interesting because in Ethiopia, the Muslims live there legitimately because they are there on orders of the Prophet. It is the Prophet who sends them there, who sends them to Ethiopia. Okay. They are not supposed to spread Islam in Ethiopia, and the Ethiopian ruler is not supposed to strengthen the faith or anything that any Muslim ruler within Islam should do. He's not even supposed to be a good Muslim, but he's supposed to protect the Muslims, which he does. The Negus protect the Muslims, of course, against the Meccans. And even when there is a case in the Sirah, you know, when one of the Muslim women, you know, she deviates from Islam, he restores her and he brings her back, making sure that the community is intact. And of course, the Abyssinian Muhajirun, yes, those who went to Ethiopia, they say, we live there until the apostle, until the messenger called us back. Okay? So in other words, they live in Ethiopia in some sort of a permanent sojourn, sojourners. In other words, they could be there forever, or they could be there for 5 minutes. It is the Prophet himself who sent them there to send them there, you know, to protect themselves from the Meccans, and you know, it is the Prophet who's going to call them back. The Chinese version, and I analyze it and I say this is kind of an interesting analogy, you know, which is analogy in reverse to the Ethiopian story. Okay, there, the two parts of the story is that the emperor, whereas in the Ethiopian case, the prophet sends them to Ethiopia in order to be protected. Yes, and he's friendly with the Negus. In China, the prophet sends the Muslims to China upon the request of the Tang Chinese emperor so that the Muslims will protect China. Okay? But again, he's friendly with the ruler there. He's friendly with the ruler there. Okay? When the Muslims of China, these legendary 3,000 Muslims who arrived in the second year of the call to the Tang capital, when they want to come back to China, to return to Mecca because they're homesick, the Chinese emperor begs the prophet to leave them in China, and the prophet says, stay in China, protect the empire by your presence, yes, as long as you are allowed to build mosques, yes, and as long as you are allowed to practice your faith. And then the story ends with saying, and we lived in China until then, you know. In other words, there is like a very, very clear, it's like exactly how the Abyssinian story ends, but here the prophet never called us back. Here he actually asked us to stay, which is why we're staying, okay. So in other words, they stay in China as permanent sojourners. You know, we are in a sort of an exile, but we are completely localized. Now, why all of this matters in the Qing context? Because, first of all, this is completely committed to writing and formulated under the Qing. In other words, we should see it as a derivative of Qing ideology. Here we are with an emperor who messes with the Tibetans, messes with the Mongols, changes everybody's story so it conforms to him. He presents himself in different ways. We can do the same thing, okay, to him. So he can mean something to us, okay? And the second thing is that when you write this story, here's what you want to do. You actually want to educate the emperor about his own duties, not vis-a-vis the larger ummah, the Ummah al-Islam all over the world, but vis-a-vis the mini ummah, the Joseph ummah that lives in exile in China. He is not supposed to be a good Muslim. He is not supposed to strengthen the faith, etc., etc., etc. But he is supposed to protect Islam and protect the Muslims. In other words, so when they write this story and they try to submit it to the emperor, they write it as a way of coded communication. It's like, if you want to be a good ruler of an empire where you have Muslims, this is what you need to do. You need to be like the Negus. Okay? And if you really want to know what the prophet expects of a Negus-like ruler, this is what you need to be doing. Okay. So, and here I already told that, you know, and the idea here is actually China becomes some sort of an Ethiopia. China is idealized as a friendly country, yes, with a friendly ruler, yes, that is decidedly not Islamic, but at the same time it protects the Muslims. Okay? Finally, and I will stop here, in the version of this story that I recently studied again, and I also discovered a Manchu version of this story. It was actually translated, it was written first in Chinese. I mean, it existed in Arabic and in Persian, and then it is written in Chinese, reworked, so that it conformed to some Chinese norms, but then, you know, it also translated into Manchu. Okay? But one of the things that happens is that the second version of it, they attach a new preface to the story. Okay? Whereas the original basically talks about the distant past of the Tang Dynasty and the Prophet, the new story actually casts the Manchu emperor himself as the one who brings the story to China from Mecca. Okay? In other words, the Manchu emperor is portrayed in a Muslim story as the one who actually delivers the story to the Chinese. And the story is amazing. You know, this is actually situated not in the conquest of Xinjiang, but in the conquest of what becomes today Inner Mongolia or Mongolia. In the 1690s, yes, in one of the expeditions, you know, the emperor goes very, very much to the east. He comes back very, very mysteriously, and he turns to one of the Muslim generals in his entourage, and he says, "Do you know who you are?" And the Muslim general, you know, being a good general, says, "No, I actually don't know my roots. I don't know anything." Okay. Do you know why we call Islam in Chinese pure and true, which is actually basically a translation of halal? Yes. And the general says, "I don't know." And the emperor asks again, "Do you know why you came from the west to China? And in what time and in what reason?" And the general says, "I don't know." Okay. And then the emperor himself says, "Look, you know, I have a book, you know, which he ostensibly obtained when he made one of his expeditions to the east. Maybe some Uyghur gave it to him, who knows, you know, but maybe not." And he says, "Here, read this book, and it will inform you on these matters." Yes. And then the emperor himself gives an order that all the Muslims in China would study that book. Now, this is not Islam. Yes, this is not the history of Islam in China. This is actually the history of Muslims in China. That's the thing that they are supposed to study. Okay? And the emperor himself in this preface is cast as someone who says, like, "Okay, you go to the leaders of your community and give them this book, print it, and educate them about their origin and about their stories." I will conclude with what happened next. Okay. Now, all of this stuff is communicated to the emperors, and they usually don't really pay attention to this. You know, they have other bigger fish than the Muslims of China, the San Muslims trying to fry. For instance, the Uyghurs. Yes, but in 1782, because of all sorts of issues that has to do with censorship in China, a copy of that book reaches the Qianlong emperor. And the argument of the Confucian mandarins is actually this is a seditious book that speaks about a certain king in the West named Muhammad that is inciting rebellion and so on. This is actually in the context of the Uyghurs rebelling. Yes. And basically they say, look, this is the book that steers all the problems. The Qianlong emperor read the book, and even though he says, and they are full of lies there, there are actually even decrees that they added into this book, also decrees from the prophet, decrees from the empresses, like worship this, worship that, all sorts of things, which are all forgeries. Yes. He actually says, you know, he issued a decree, says, release everybody whom you arrested, because they arrested many people connected with the book. The book actually talks about good Muslims. Yes, they are loyal subjects of the throne, and they are my children. In other words, he bought the entire forgery, because it did conform very, very creatively to Manchu Chiga ideology as it had been projected for about 100 years up to that moment. Okay? Even though it was very, very clear, you know, that the stories told there, you know, were completely, completely wrong. And why is it important to today? This basically is a moment in which, you know, the Muslims, at least Muslims elite, carve themselves a cultural space that make it possible for them to live in China because they have this relationship with the emperor. That's the basis for their existence until the moment that the empire falls and now there is a republic. Okay? And when the Manchus fell, I mean, when you look at what Muslim elites at that time do, in the beginning of the 20th century, you see them in a state of panic. Yes, one of the leaders of the Muslims in Tianjin asked, he says, if the Manchus are gone, what will happen to the faith? Okay? He's worried about the faith in that context. Okay? And here, I don't know, I'm being recorded, so I'm going to be very, very careful. One of the arguments that I'm making in the book that I'm working on right now is, in fact, that the people who really internalized the Manchu-Qing argument about we are the protectors of Islam were the Japanese. Because the Japanese said, you know, we are creating this multi-ethnic Asian empire, we are creating all of these great things, and they actually actively encourage Muslims in China to join them. Yes. Many Muslims did join the Japanese when they conquered China, based on this argument, on the Japanese argument, and they are considered today traitors in China, okay? People who betrayed the Chinese nation. I would suggest, I actually argue that, but I suggest that because I know this is going to be viewed in China. I actually suggest that what they do is a very, very logical move. They say, okay, well, one empire was there. We had lived with them very, very nicely. Now the republic is actually very, very narrow. It speaks about a Chinese nation that threatened to exclude us. Yes? And here's a new empire. And they are the new protectors of Islam. And this is, by the way, Japanese propaganda is all about we are protectors of Islam. And, you know, all they do, these are the successors of the Qing. You know, we should continue. Continue with them, and so on. Okay. And I will conclude here.